Ambassador Vielthra Sohn Kal was sitting in her private chamber aboard the diplomatic station Halo of Accord when the emergency signal came through, and it changed everything she had ever believed about the galaxy. The message was short and cold, stamped with a Priority 1 classification that she had not seen in over 40 cycles of service. Anomalous sapient emissions detected from quarantine system, Sector 77G, Sol Star, 3rd planet, Class 12 Deathworld. She read it again, and then a third time, because the words did not make any sense to her. A Class 12 Deathworld was the highest danger rating the Galactic Concord had ever given to any planet. And in the entire history of the Concord, over 12,000 standard cycles of exploration and cataloging, fewer than 100 worlds had ever earned that terrible number. Most of them were volcanic wastelands, or radiation-blasted rocks, where nothing larger than a microbe could survive. And the very idea that something intelligent could live on one of those worlds was considered impossible by every serious scientist in the known galaxy. And yet, the deep survey vessel, Whisper of Tides, had picked up something from the 3rd planet of the Sol system. Organized radio waves, satellite signals, and structured light emissions that could only come from a technological civilization. Vielthra contacted the Concord Science Directorate immediately, and within hours, an emergency session was called in the Grand Forum, where representatives of over 4,000 spacefaring species gathered in a vast amphitheater of floating platforms and holographic displays. The debate was fierce from the very first moment. "This is clearly a sensor malfunction," declared High Scientist Torvan Kell, a tall and thin Melvari whose species had evolved on a world so peaceful that the loudest natural sound was the wind through crystal forests. Nothing that thinks could survive on a Class 12 world long enough to build anything, let alone a civilization. The radiation alone would destroy neural tissue within a generation, and the predatory ecosystem would consume any slow-developing species before it could reach sapience. But the data was clear, and no one could deny it. Dren Sokava, a meticulous analyst from the insectoid Kethari species, had spent 3 days reviewing the raw sensor feeds, and his report was delivered in the calm and clicking tones of his kind. The emissions are not random. They are structured, layered, and broadcast on thousands of frequencies simultaneously. There are visual transmissions, audio transmissions, and data packets of extraordinary complexity. Whoever lives on this world is not primitive. They are loud, and they are everywhere on the planet's surface. Vielthra watched the reactions around the forum with growing unease. Some delegates laughed nervously, others whispered to their aides, and a few, the ones who understood military implications, had gone very quiet. Commander Rethis Vaughn, the military attaché assigned to the Observation Initiative, was one of the quiet ones. He was Gorvathi, a species known for their thick natural armor and calm temperament, and he sat perfectly still as the data scrolled across his display, his 4 eyes moving independently as he processed the planetary profile of Sol 3. The profile was a nightmare written in numbers. Sol 3 orbited an unstable G-type star that regularly hurled massive bursts of radiation across its system. The planet itself had a molten iron core that generated a magnetic field, the only thing standing between the surface and the killing radiation of space. And that field was inconsistent and unreliable. The atmosphere was composed primarily of nitrogen and oxygen was a corrosive and highly flammable gas that most Concord species considered toxic. The surface temperature swung wildly between extremes that would kill a Valori in minutes, from far below freezing to scorching heat that could boil water. The planet was tectonically active, meaning the very ground split open and shook without warning. Massive storms of water and electrical discharge swept across the surface regularly. And the biosphere was a war zone of predators, parasites, toxins, and microscopic organisms, that waged constant invisible battles inside every living thing. And in the middle of all that chaos, something had built cities. The Concord voted, after 12 hours of debate, to send a shielded observation flotilla to the Sol system. 5 ships, led by Vielthra aboard the diplomatic cruiser Gentle Horizon, with strict orders to observe only and make no contact unless authorized by the full council. The journey took 11 days through faster-than-light corridors, and Vielthra spent most of that time reading everything the Concord had ever recorded about Class 12 worlds. There was not much, because no one had ever had a reason to study them closely. They were marked on star charts with red warning symbols and left alone, the way a sensible person avoids a burning building. When the flotilla dropped out of FTL at the edge of the Sol system, the first thing Vielthra noticed was the star itself. It was angry and bright and hurling streams of charged particles into the void, and her ship's radiation shields immediately increased to combat levels, just from the ambient energy in the system. "This star is actively hostile," murmured the Gentle Horizon's navigation officer, a small Palathi with trembling antennae. "How does anything survive here?" They moved inward carefully, past a belt of tumbling asteroids that would have shredded an unshielded vessel, past gas giants of terrifying scale, and finally into visual range of the third planet. It was blue and green and white, wrapped in swirling clouds, and it was, against all logic, beautiful, but the scan data told a different story. The long-range sensors lit up with billions of life signs, not just animals and plants, but sapient beings, clustered in massive population centers that glowed with artificial light on the planet's dark side. There were satellites in orbit, debris from old machines, and chemical traces in the upper atmosphere that suggested widespread industrial activity. The oceans were vast and deep, and filled with creatures that the biological scanner flagged as extremely dangerous. The land masses were covered in every type of biome imaginable: frozen ice, burning desert, dense jungle, open grassland, and in every single one of them, the sapient species had built something. They were everywhere. Vielthra stood at the main viewport and stared at the planet below, and for the first time in her long career, she felt something she had never felt before: a deep and primal fear, not of a weapon or a threat, but of the sheer stubborn impossibility of what she was seeing. Her species, the Velori, had evolved on a garden world with a constant mild climate and soft breezes and no predator larger than her own hand. They had reached space, gently, slowly, over millions of careful cycles of gradual progress. These creatures had clawed their way to civilization on a world that was actively trying to kill them every single day, and they had done it in what appeared to be a shockingly short time. Their recorded history spanned only a few thousand of their local years, a blink in galactic terms. They did not just survive the Deathworld, Vielthra whispered to no one in particular, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ship. They conquered it. Commander Rethus stepped up beside her, his armored form reflected in the viewport glass, and he said nothing for a long moment before speaking in a low and careful voice. "Ambassador, I have run preliminary combat projections based on their broadcast content and technological signatures." "And?" she asked, though she was not sure she wanted the answer. "We should be very, very careful with this species, because if they ever decide to leave that world in force, I am not sure anything in the Concord could stop them." Vielthra looked back at the blue planet spinning slowly below, so full of life and fury and impossible, stubborn survival, and she made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. She opened the secure channel to the Concord High Council and spoke 5 words that sent a shockwave through 4,000 civilizations. "We need to talk to them." For 17 days, the observation flotilla hung in the darkness, beyond the orbit of Sol 3's single large moon. And for 17 days, the intelligence team aboard the Gentle Horizon worked without rest to decode the endless flood of signals pouring off the planet below. Drem Sakava, the Cathari analyst, had not slept in 4 days. His species could function for extended periods without rest, but even he was beginning to feel the weight of what he was uncovering. Every new file he decoded, every broadcast he translated, every image he processed, added another layer to a picture that was becoming more terrifying by the hour. He had started with the easy things: mathematical broadcasts, scientific data, technical schematics, and those alone had been enough to impress him. The humans, as they called themselves, had a surprisingly advanced understanding of physics and chemistry for a species that had only been industrialized for a few hundred of their local years. They had split the atom, mapped their own genetic code, and sent machines to other planets in their system, all while living on a world that was constantly trying to murder them. But it was when Dren moved on to the cultural and historical broadcasts that things became truly disturbing. He called an emergency briefing in the Gentle Horizons main conference chamber, and every senior officer attended. Ambassador Vielthra, Commander Rethis, Medical Officer Ilian Ren, and a dozen department heads who had no idea what they were about to hear. "I will begin with biology," Dren said, his mandibles clicking softly as he activated the holographic display. "Medical Officer Ilian has compiled a full biological profile, and I will let her present those findings first." Ilian Ren was a Vielari like Vielthra, small and delicate with luminous silver eyes that were currently wide with something between fascination and horror. She stepped forward, and the holographic display lit up with the image of a human body. Tall, bipedal, with an internal skeleton and external muscles wrapped in soft but surprisingly resilient skin. "Where do I even begin?" Ilian said, and there was a tremor in her voice that made several officers shift uncomfortably. "These creatures are, and I want to be very precise here, among the most dangerous biological organisms the Concord has ever catalogued, and they do not even realize it." She gestured, and the display zoomed into the skeletal structure. Their bones are made from a calcium phosphate composite that is remarkably strong, and this is the part that frightened me, self-repairing. When a human breaks a bone, the bone grows back together on its own, often stronger than it was before. They do not need medical intervention for this, it simply happens. Their bodies treat catastrophic structural damage as a temporary inconvenience. The room was very quiet. Their muscles are dense and powerful, capable of explosive force that far exceeds what their size would suggest. They are not the strongest species we have encountered, but they have something far more dangerous: endurance. Humans evolved as persistent predators on the open plains of their world, which means they did not chase prey by being faster. They chased it by being relentless. They would follow an animal for hours, sometimes days, never stopping, never resting enough to let the prey recover, until the target simply collapsed from exhaustion and could no longer run. No other sapient species in the Concord evolved this hunting strategy, and I believe there is a reason for that. It requires a kind of biological stubbornness that borders on madness. Commander Rethis leaned forward, his 4 eyes narrowing. "They also possess a chemical override system," Ilian continued. "When threatened or injured, their bodies flood with a compound called adrenaline, which suppresses pain, increases strength, accelerates reflexes, and allows them to continue functioning through injuries that would incapacitate or kill any Concord species. There are documented cases of humans continuing to fight and move with broken bones, massive blood loss, and damage to internal organs. Their bodies essentially have an emergency combat mode that ignores the signals telling them to stop." A Palathi delegate made a soft sound of distress. "They are omnivores. They eat both plants and the flesh of other animals, including animals that are themselves predators. They consume a chemical called capsaicin, which is a neurotoxin that causes intense burning pain, and they eat it deliberately because they enjoy the sensation. They drink ethanol, which is a cellular poison for recreational purposes. Their immune system is in a constant state of war against billions of microorganisms that live inside and on their bodies: bacteria, viruses, fungi, parasites. And they function normally while this invisible battle rages every moment of their lives. She paused and looked around the room. And perhaps most disturbing of all, they form emotional bonds with predatory animals. They take creatures with fangs and claws and hunting instincts into their homes and treat them as family members. They call them pets, and they love them, and the predators love them back. I do not fully understand how this is possible, but it appears to be one of the defining characteristics of the species. Ilian stepped back, and Dren took over, his clicking voice steady, but carrying an edge that everyone could hear. I will now cover what I have learned from their historical and cultural records, he said, and I want to warn everyone in this room that what I am about to share is deeply unsettling. He activated a new display showing a timeline of human history. In the short span of their recorded civilization, roughly 10,000 of their years, they have experienced repeated, large-scale conflicts that they call wars. These are not small territorial disputes. These are organized campaigns of mass violence involving millions and sometimes billions of individuals. Their most recent global conflict, which they refer to as the Second World War, resulted in the deaths of between 70 and 85 million humans in a span of just 6 of their years. Several officers stood up from their seats. One left the room entirely. They developed weapons capable of splitting atomic nuclei and releasing energy equivalent to their most powerful natural disasters. And then they used these weapons on each other, on population centers filled with civilians. They have since built thousands more of these weapons and pointed them at their own cities as a deterrent strategy they call mutually assured destruction, which is exactly what it sounds like. The promise that if one group attacks, everyone dies. And this system has apparently kept a kind of peace among them for decades. That is insane, whispered a Gorvathi officer. Yes, Dren agreed, and yet it worked. I want to draw your attention to something important. Every catastrophe this species has faced, whether war or plague or natural disaster, has been followed not by collapse, but by rapid adaptation and growth. They do not break, they bend and then spring back harder than before. Their history is not a story of survival. It is a story of repeated near extinction, followed by furious, stubborn recovery. He brought up one final display, a psychological profile compiled from thousands of hours of human cultural output. There is a trait in their psychology that has no equivalent in any Concord species. They call it spite. It is the willingness to suffer personal harm in order to inflict greater harm on an enemy. It is irrational by every game theory model we use, and yet it is deeply embedded in their decision-making. They will burn their own resources, sacrifice their own comfort, and endure tremendous pain simply to ensure that an opponent does not win. He paused. But there is another side to this. They also possess an equally irrational capacity for compassion and self-sacrifice. They will run into burning structures to save strangers. They will give their own food to others who are hungry. They will throw themselves onto explosive devices to shield people they have never met. They bond in groups with a loyalty so fierce that they will die for each other without hesitation. And this is not limited to their own families or tribes. They will do it for complete strangers, and sometimes even for members of other species. Dren turned off the display and faced the room in silence for a long moment. They are the most contradictory species I have ever studied, he said. They are capable of breathtaking cruelty and breathtaking kindness, often in the same individual, sometimes in the same moment. They create art of extraordinary beauty while building weapons of extraordinary destruction. They write poetry about love and then march into battle. They are, in every sense, a species forged in fire. And the fire did not destroy them. It made them into something the galaxy has never seen before. Commander Rethus broke the silence that followed. "I ran combat simulations," he said, his deep voice rumbling through the chamber. "I will not share the exact numbers because they have been classified at my request, but I will say this. In a ground engagement between a standard Concord infantry unit and an equivalent number of unaugmented human soldiers, the humans win in every scenario I tested. Every single one." The room erupted in anxious voices, but Vialthra raised her hand and silence returned. She stood and walked to the viewport, where the blue-green planet hung in the darkness like a jewel wrapped in clouds, so beautiful and so impossibly dangerous. "I am sending a Priority 1 recommendation to the High Council," she said, and her voice was calm, but carried the weight of absolute conviction. "We do not quarantine this species. We do not ignore them. We do not threaten them. We invite them to the table, and we do it now, because I would rather have them sitting across from us as friends than standing outside as something else entirely." She turned back to face the room. "Because if they come out on their own terms, without our hand extended in welcome, they will come out angry, and I do not think any of us want to see what an angry human looks like." No one in the room disagreed. The message the Concord sent towards Sol 3 was carefully written over the course of 6 days by a committee of 47 linguists, diplomats, and cultural specialists, and it was designed to be as gentle and non-threatening as possible. A simple greeting, a statement of peaceful intent, and an invitation to communicate. It was transmitted in 12 human languages simultaneously, beamed toward the planet on frequencies the humans were known to monitor. The response came back in 14 minutes. Vialthra was on the bridge of the gentle horizon when the communication officer, a young Palathi with wide, nervous eyes, turned in her seat and spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper. "Ambassador, they have responded." "Already," Vialthra said, because 14 minutes was barely enough time for the signal to reach the planet and return. "What does it say?" The officer swallowed hard and put the message on the main display. It was written not in any human language, but in perfect Concord Common, the diplomatic language of 4,000 species, a language that had never been transmitted anywhere near this system. And it read, "We have been waiting, sending a delegation. Please do not shoot." The bridge went completely silent. Dren, who was standing near the sensor station, made a series of rapid clicks with his mandibles, the Cathari equivalent of stunned disbelief, and immediately began running calculations on how the humans could possibly have learned Concord Common. The answer, when it came, was both impressive and alarming. They had been intercepting and decoding the flotilla's internal communications since the moment it entered the Sol system, silently listening and learning, without anyone on any of the 5 ships detecting so much as a whisper of intrusion. "They have been inside our communication network for 17 days, Dren said flatly, "and we never knew." Commander Rethus said a word in Gorvathi that did not translate well, but roughly meant something between a curse and a prayer. 3 hours later, a vessel appeared on sensors, rising from the planet's surface through the atmosphere with a trail of fire and brute chemical thrust that made every engineer in the flotilla wince. It was not elegant. It was not graceful. It was a blunt, angular thing made of thick metal plates and covered in what appeared to be layers of armor, radiation shielding, and redundant hull plating. It looked less like a spacecraft and more like a fortress that had been given engines. "Their ship is heavily armored," Rethus observed quietly, "far more than necessary for simple travel." "Their species did not build ships to travel through space," Dren replied. "They built ships to survive space. To them, the void is just another enemy to be endured." The human vessel docked with the gentle horizon through a pressurized airlock, and Vialthra assembled a formal welcome party in the main reception corridor. Herself, Rethus, Dren, Ilian, and a dozen Concord honor guards who had been chosen for their calm temperaments and non-threatening appearance. The airlock hissed and opened. 5 humans walked through. The one in front was a woman, short by human standards, with dark hair pulled back from her face, and dark eyes that moved across the corridor with a quick, sweeping attention that missed nothing. She wore a crisp uniform of dark blue, and walked with the easy, balanced stride of someone who was always ready to move in any direction at any moment. Her name, they would learn, was Captain Elena Vasquez. Behind her came 4 others, a tall man with kind eyes and the careful manner of a scholar, who was introduced as Dr. James Park, their linguist. A woman with red hair and a sharp, curious gaze, named Dr. Amira Osei, their scientist. A broad-shouldered man in formal military dress, whose posture and watchful stillness immediately drew Rethus's professional attention, introduced as Sergeant Kofi Asante, and a slim, smiling woman named Sarah Chen, their diplomatic attaché. The first thing Vielthra noticed, and she would write about this extensively in her reports, was the way the humans moved. It was subtle, and she might have missed it if Dren had not briefed her on predator behavior. But every single one of them, even the smiling diplomat, entered the corridor the same way. Eyes scanning corners, bodies balanced, weight distributed for rapid response. They catalogued the space around them, the way a hunting animal catalogues a new environment, identifying exits, obstacles, and potential threats. And they did it so naturally and so quickly that it was clearly not a conscious action, but an instinct built into the very core of their being. The second thing she noticed was that Captain Vasquez was smiling, and the smile showed her teeth, white, flat, with the remnants of canines that had once been much sharper. And Vielthra had to actively suppress the flinch that her own instincts demanded, because in most Concord species, baring teeth was a threat display. Ambassador Sonkal, Vasquez said, and her voice was warm and steady, and carried an accent that gave the Concord syllables a strange new music. Thank you for the invitation. It is an honor to meet you. We brought gifts, and they had. Sergeant Asante carried a large case, and from it, the humans produced an extraordinary collection of offerings. Sealed containers of a dark, aromatic liquid they called coffee. Bars of a sweet brown substance called chocolate. Packets of seeds from their world's plants. Small devices containing recordings of their music, and most remarkably, a handwritten letter from the leader of an organization called the United Nations, penned on paper made from the pulp of their planet's trees. Vielthra accepted the gifts with the formal grace of a career diplomat, but inside she was reeling. These were apex predators from the deadliest world in the known galaxy, a species that had survived ice ages, and plagues, and nuclear weapons, and each other, and they had walked onto an alien vessel and brought presents like guests arriving at a friend's home. The formal dinner that followed was held in the Gentle Horizons diplomatic suite, and it was one of the most surreal experiences of Vielthra's life. The humans ate the alien food that was placed before them without complaint, even though Ilian later confirmed that their biology could barely process most of it, and that at least 2 of the dishes would have caused them significant digestive discomfort. They ate it anyway, smiling and complimenting the flavors because, as Vielthra would come to understand, humans considered it deeply rude to refuse hospitality, even when the hospitality was mildly poisoning them. Conversation flowed more easily than anyone had expected. The humans were curious and engaged, asking questions about the Concord with the wide-eyed enthusiasm of children discovering a new playground. Dr. Park wanted to know about languages. Dr. Osei asked about faster-than-light travel, with a hunger in her eyes that was almost physical. Sarah Chen navigated the complex social dynamics of a multi-species dinner table with a grace that impressed even Vielthra. But it was Captain Vasquez who delivered the moment that would be replayed across the galaxy for centuries. A Pilothi delegate, emboldened by the warmth of the evening, asked her directly, "Captain, Your species has clearly had the capability to detect signals beyond your own world for some time. Why did you never reach out to the galaxy before now?" Vasquez set down her eating utensil, a small metal fork that the humans had brought because Concord dining implements did not fit their hands, and was quiet for a long moment. "Because we were too busy fighting each other," she said, and there was no shame in her voice, only a calm and honest weight. "We almost did not make it. There were times, many times, when we came very close to ending ourselves. We split the atom before we learned to share a planet. And we spent decades with enough weapons pointed at our own cities to burn the world several times over. We are not proud of all of our history, but we are here, and that is not nothing." The silence that followed her words filled the entire room like water filling a glass, and no one broke it for a very long time. After the dinner ended, and the humans were escorted to guest quarters that had been hastily modified to support their atmospheric and gravity needs, Dren retreated to his analysis station and pulled up the security recordings from the entire evening. He watched them 3 times, and on the third viewing, he found what he was looking for. Sergeant Kofi Asante, the Marine who had smiled warmly and shaken hands and made friendly small talk about the beauty of the Gentle Horizons architecture, had within the first 90 seconds of boarding the ship, identified every structural weakness in the corridor walls, mentally mapped at least 3 escape routes through the vessel, noted the positions of all emergency systems. Between Captain Vasquez and every doorway, every corridor junction, and every unfamiliar alien who came within 3 meters of her. He had done all of this while laughing at a joke Sarah Chen had made about the docking procedure. Dren stared at the footage and felt a cold clarity settle over his analytical mind. He opened a new file, marked it with the highest security classification available to him, and typed a single note that he would later present to the full Concord Council. They are never not assessing threats, not when they are eating, not when they are laughing, not when they are being kind. The kindness is real, but underneath it, every single one of them is a soldier on unfamiliar ground. They have been this way for so long that they do not even notice it anymore. This is not training. This is what their world made them. Do not mistake their warmth for weakness, because the warmth and the danger are the same thing. He closed the file and sat in the dim light of his station for a long time, listening to the faint hum of the ship around him, thinking about a species that brought chocolate to first contact and mapped escape routes while smiling. He was beginning to understand why their planet had not killed them. They were simply too stubborn, too adaptable, and too irrationally kind to die. The peace lasted for 312 days. In that time, the human delegation had been moved from the Gentle Horizon to the great diplomatic station Halo of Accord, where they lived as provisional observers among the representatives of 4,000 spacefaring civilizations. They learned, they listened, they made friends with species that looked nothing like them, and they drank an astonishing amount of coffee that they had shipped in from Sol 3 at their own expense. Captain Elena Vasquez had become something of a celebrity on the station. She was invited to diplomatic functions and scientific symposiums and cultural exchanges, and she attended all of them with the same steady calm and quiet curiosity that had marked her from the very first day. Species that had once flinched at the sight of a human were beginning to relax around her, drawn in by her warmth and her habit of remembering the names of everyone she met, even the maintenance workers and junior staff that most ambassadors ignored entirely. Sergeant Asante had become a fixture in the station's recreational areas, where he taught interested aliens a human game called chess, and told stories about Earth that left his audiences either laughing or staring in stunned silence, sometimes both at the same time. It was almost easy to forget what the humans really were. And then the Harrock came back. The first warning arrived at the Halo of Accord on a priority channel from the Outer Veil monitoring network, a long chain of sensor stations that watched the borders of Concord space for threats from the unknown regions beyond. The message was terse and clinical, as all military communications were, but the content was enough to drain the color from every face that read it. Massive fleet movement detected crossing the Outer Veil. Signature matches Herok Collective. Estimated vessel count exceeds 800. Trajectory indicates Pelethy Corridor. Estimated time to contact with first inhabited system, 41 standard days. The Herok Collective was the oldest and most terrible threat the Concord had ever faced. A species of insectoid organisms linked by a hive intelligence that operated with a single consuming purpose: expand, consume, and expand again. They did not negotiate because they had no concept of negotiation. They did not show mercy because mercy was meaningless to a mind that viewed all non-Herok life as raw material. Their last incursion, over 3,000 cycles ago, had cost the Concord 200 worlds and taken nearly a millennium to push back. And the only reason it had ended at all was that the swarm had simply decided that the cost of further expansion exceeded the nutritional benefit. They had been dormant since then, rebuilding, growing, waiting in the dark spaces beyond the veil. And now they were moving again, aimed directly at the Pelethy Corridor, a region of space containing 37 inhabited worlds and over 9 billion sentient beings. The Concord's response was immediate, and it was chaos. Emergency sessions were called in the Grand Forum, and representatives screamed at each other across the chamber, while military commanders scrambled to assess the situation. The problem was simple and devastating. The Concord had not fought a real war in centuries. Their military fleet was designed for peacekeeping, for escort duty, for the gentle management of trade disputes and border disagreements. It was not built to fight a Herok swarm, and everyone in the room knew it. Evacuation plans were proposed for the corridor worlds. Calculations were made about how many transport ships would be needed, how many billions of people could be moved, and how many would be left behind. The numbers were horrifying, and the arguments about who would be saved and who would be abandoned grew louder and more desperate by the hour. On the third day of emergency sessions, Captain Elena Vasquez requested an audience with the High Council. She was told that the matter did not concern a provisional species, and that her request was denied. She showed up anyway. The guards at the entrance to the council chamber were 2 large Gorvathi in ceremonial armor, and they blocked the doorway with the professional firmness of beings who had been told to let no one pass. Vasquez stood in front of them, a full head shorter than either of them, and looked up into their armored faces with an expression that was not angry, not demanding, but absolutely and completely unwilling to leave. "I understand that I have not been invited," she said, "but 9 billion people are about to die, and I can help. You can let me in, or I can stand here until someone with the authority to make a better decision comes along. I am very patient." She was admitted 7 minutes later. The council chamber was enormous, filled with floating platforms and holographic displays showing the advancing Herok fleet as a swarm of red markers moving slowly and inevitably toward the corridor. Every senior representative of the Concord was present, and most of them looked exhausted and afraid. Vasquez walked to the center of the chamber, a small human figure surrounded by thousands of aliens representing civilizations that had existed for millennia before her species had learned to use fire. And she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. "I know what you are doing in here," she said. "You are deciding who lives and who dies. You are drawing lines on maps and calculating acceptable losses and telling yourselves that this is the best you can do. And I understand why. Because you are good people who have lived in peace for a very long time, and you have forgotten what it feels like to fight for your survival." She paused and looked around the room. My people have not forgotten. We have never had the luxury of forgetting. We come from a world that tried to kill us every single day. Earthquakes, volcanoes, ice ages, plagues, predators, and each other. And we are still here. Not because we are the strongest, or the fastest, or the smartest, but because when something tries to end us, we do not run. We push back. The chamber was silent. You gave us a seat at this table. You showed us that we were not alone in the universe. That means something to us. So I am telling you now, you are not going to lose those worlds. Not while we are here. Point us at the problem. The vote that followed was the fastest in Concord history. Provisional combat authorization was granted to humanity by an overwhelming margin. And within hours, Vasquez was on a secure channel back to Sol 3, speaking to the military leaders of every major nation on Earth. What happened next stunned the galaxy. Humanity mobilized with a speed and efficiency that no Concord species could comprehend. Within weeks, a combined human fleet, military warships, retrofitted civilian vessels, cargo haulers converted into troop transports, and experimental craft that had never been tested outside their home system, launched from Earth orbit and made the faster-than-light journey to the Palathi corridor, using Concord navigation data and hastily installed alien drive systems. The ships were ugly, patched together, and in some cases held together by what human engineers cheerfully described as hope and welding. But they were armed. They were crewed by volunteers who knew the odds, and they were angry. The Battle of Palathi Station began on the 41st day. The Harak Vanguard, 800 ships, each one a massive organic construct filled with thousands of drone warriors, dropped out of their transit corridor and found not an empty corridor waiting to be consumed, but a wall of metal and fire. Human tactics were nothing like Concord military doctrine. Where the Concord favored formation fighting and energy-based standoff weapons, the humans used ambush, misdirection, electronic warfare, and a terrifying willingness to close to point-blank range. They sent drone ships loaded with explosives directly into Harak formations. They used their own vessels as shields to protect civilian evacuation transports. They targeted the swarm's communication nodes with surgical precision, isolating groups and picking them apart. Sergeant Kofi Asante led a Marine boarding action onto a Harak command vessel, a mission that had been assigned a 12% survival probability before launch. And his team fought through corridors filled with razor-limbed drone warriors for 6 hours before reaching the neural core of the ship and destroying it. The loss of that single command node caused 17 Harak ships to lose coordination simultaneously, creating a gap in the swarm's formation that the human fleet exploited ruthlessly. The battle lasted 9 hours. When it was over, 312 Harak ships had been destroyed, and the rest had pulled back to a holding position, something the swarm had never done in recorded history. They had always pushed forward, always consumed, always advanced. But now, for the first time, their hive intelligence had encountered something it could not calculate. A species that fought harder the more it was hurt, that treated death as an acceptable cost, that did not retreat when the numbers turned against them, but instead attacked with greater fury. The Harak did not feel fear. Their biology did not allow for it, but their strategic calculus had fundamentally changed. The equation of consumption versus cost, which had always favored expansion, no longer balanced. On the bridge of the human flagship Defiance, a battered, scarred vessel that had taken hits that would have destroyed any Concord ship 3 times over, Captain Elena Vasquez sat in her command chair and watched the Harak fleet hold position on the tactical display. There was blood on her uniform from a shrapnel wound in her side that she had not mentioned to anyone. And she had been awake for 31 hours, and she was still thinking, still planning, still refusing to stop. She opened a communication channel to the gentle horizon, where Ambassador Vielthra had been watching the battle in stunned, horrified, awed silence. "They have stopped," Vasquez said, and her voice was tired, but her eyes were not. "Now let us make sure they never come back." And somewhere in the vast hive mind of the Harak Collective, a new classification was created for the first time in its ancient existence. A designation for a species that was not prey, not predator, not obstacle, but something else entirely. A species that simply refused to lose, no matter the cost, no matter the pain, no matter how impossible the odds. The Harak had no word for what the humans were, but they learned on that day to be careful around them. The war against the Harak Collective lasted 4 months. It was the most violent conflict the Galactic Concord had witnessed in over 3,000 cycles, and it was fought on a scale that most living beings in the galaxy had only read about in ancient history archives. But unlike the last Harak incursion, which had dragged on for nearly a millennium, this one ended quickly, not because the Harak were weaker than before, but because the force opposing them was something entirely new. Human generals worked alongside Concord strategists in a fusion of military thinking that no one had imagined possible. The Concord brought technology, intelligence networks, and knowledge of the swarm's biology, while the humans brought something the Concord had lost long ago: the ruthless, creative, and deeply personal art of war. Human tacticians devised strategies that appalled their alien counterparts, and then executed them with a precision that earned grudging and then genuine respect. They used deception, psychological pressure, scorched earth retreats, and devastating counteroffensives that struck the Harak in ways the hive mind could not predict, because no species in its long memory had ever fought like this. The combined fleet pushed the swarm back, system by system, corridor by corridor, past the worlds it had tried to consume and beyond, all the way to the outer veil, and then through it, driving the Harak into the dark spaces beyond Concord territory. With a relentlessness that echoed humanity's oldest instincts, the persistent predators of Sol 3, chasing their prey until it could run no more. And then something happened that had never happened before in the entire recorded history of the Harak Collective. They sued for a territorial agreement. The Harak did not understand peace. Their biology had no framework for the concept. But they understood cost, and the cost of continuing to fight the humans had exceeded anything their strategic calculus could justify. So they designated all human-occupied and human-allied space as a no-consumption zone, the highest possible acknowledgement of a threat in Harak terms, and withdrew into their own territory. The war was over, but the cost had been real. Thousands of human soldiers had died in the fighting, young men and women who had volunteered to cross the stars and fight for species they had never met on worlds they had never seen. The flagship Defiance, which had become a symbol of the war effort, was so badly damaged that it could not be repaired. It was towed back to Concord space and placed in a permanent orbit above Palathi Station as a memorial, its scarred hull turning slowly in the starlight, a monument to stubbornness and sacrifice. Sergeant Kofi Asante survived, though he had lost his left arm in the boarding action that had turned the first battle. The Concord's medical technology was far beyond anything Earth possessed, and they fitted him with a biosynthetic replacement that was stronger and more sensitive than the original. When the procedure was complete, Asante flexed his new fingers, grinned, and told the medical team that he was finally getting an upgrade. A joke that confused every alien in the room, but made Captain Vasquez laugh so hard she had to sit down. Vasquez herself was offered the Light of Accord, the highest civilian honor the Concord could bestow, an award that had been given fewer than 100 times in 12,000 cycles. She accepted it not for herself, but on behalf of every human who had served. And she stood before the full assembly of the Grand Forum in her battered uniform with the medal shining on her chest, and said simply, "This belongs to the ones who did not come home." The galaxy had changed, and everyone knew it. The Concorde was forced to reckon with what it had witnessed, not just the violence, though the violence had been staggering, but the whole of what humanity was. Because the same species that had fought with such terrifying ferocity had also done things that made no strategic sense at all. Human soldiers had carried wounded aliens off battlefields at great personal risk. Human medics had treated Concorde casualties before their own. A human pilot had deliberately crashed her damaged fighter into a Herrick assault ship to protect an evacuation transport filled with Palathi civilians she had never met. And her last recorded transmission had been a calm report of her intent, followed by the words, "Take care of each other." They were violent and compassionate, brutal and gentle, calculating and wildly sentimental, and none of these qualities canceled out any of the others. They existed together in the same hearts, woven so tightly that they could not be separated, and the galaxy did not have a framework for understanding a species like this. But it was learning. Humanity was granted full membership in the Galactic Concorde, the fastest ascension in its 12,000 cycle history, approved by a unanimous vote that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Human ambassadors, scientists, engineers, artists, soldiers, and ordinary civilians began spreading across Concorde space. And everywhere they went, they brought the things that made them human. They brought coffee, which became the most traded human commodity in the galaxy within 6 months, consumed with varying degrees of delight and confusion by species whose biochemistry had never encountered caffeine before. They brought music, vast archives of sound that ranged from thundering orchestral compositions to soft acoustic melodies to rhythmic electronic pulses that some alien species found hypnotic. A Cathari concert hall began hosting human musical performances, and the shows sold out within minutes every time. They brought their stubborn, irrational, deeply human habit of bonding with everything around them. Within a year, humans on Concorde stations had befriended species that other aliens considered terrifying, had adopted alien animals as pets, had learned to cook alien food and share it at gatherings where a dozen species sat together at tables that had been modified to accommodate wildly different body shapes. They called these gatherings potlucks, and the concept spread across the galaxy like wildfire. They brought a word that the Concorde had never had a translation for, grit, which meant something like the refusal to quit, the determination to keep going when everything said you should stop, the stubborn fire in the heart that burns even when the body is broken and the odds are impossible. The Veilori tried to find an equivalent in their own language and failed. The Gorvathi, whose culture valued endurance, came closest but admitted that the human version was something more, something fiercer and more personal, as if every individual human carried their own small war inside them and fought it every day just to keep moving forward. And through it all, the humans kept surprising the galaxy. A human engineer on a Concorde research station figured out how to increase the efficiency of faster-than-light drives by 11%, using an approach that no alien scientist had considered, because it involved deliberately stressing the drive components in a way that would have been considered reckless. "It works better under pressure," she explained with a shrug, and no one was sure if she was talking about the drive or about her species. A human diplomat resolved a territorial dispute between two species that had been arguing for 800 cycles by inviting both delegations to a shared meal and refusing to discuss the issue until everyone had eaten. By the time the food was finished, the delegates were laughing together, and the agreement was signed before dessert. A human child on a Concorde station, no more than 7 years old, wandered away from her parents and was found 2 hours later in the quarters of a Gorvathi warrior, sitting on his lap and braiding decorative cords into his armor, while he sat perfectly still, terrified of frightening her, and simultaneously experiencing an emotion he had never felt before, the warm, bewildering gentleness of being trusted completely by a small creature who had decided he was a friend. In her private quarters, aboard the rebuilt Gentle Horizon, Ambassador Vielfra Sonkal sat at her desk and composed her final report on the human integration. She had spent over a year with this species now, and she had filled hundreds of files with observations, analyses, and personal reflections. But this was the last one, the summary that would go into the permanent Concord archives and be read by diplomats and scholars for thousands of cycles to come. She stared at the blank document for a long time before she began to write. I was asked, when this process began, whether humanity posed a threat to the Concord. I answered then that they did, the gravest threat we have ever faced. I stand by that assessment, but not for the reasons that were assumed. They are not a threat because they could destroy us, though they could. They are a threat because they have shown us what we forgot, that the galaxy is not safe, has never been safe, and that survival is not a right, but a choice, made every single day by those stubborn enough to keep making it. She paused, looked out her viewport at the stars, and continued. They are loud, they are reckless, they are sentimental to the point of irrationality. They form bonds with creatures that could kill them and feel genuine grief when those creatures die. They run toward danger instead of away from it. They make jokes in the middle of battles and cry at the beauty of a sunset on a world they have never visited before. They are contradictions wrapped in contradictions, and they do not apologize for any of it. She smiled, a gesture she had learned from the humans, and had begun to find comforting rather than threatening. They may be the best thing that has ever happened to us. She saved the document and closed her terminal, and as she did, a sound drifted through the open communication channel from the station's main docking bay. A human cargo freighter, ugly and patched and blaring music from its open comms, was lumbering past a formation of sleek Concord cruisers. A voice crackled across the channel, cheerful and utterly unbothered by the grandeur of the vessels around it. Hey, pretty ships, anyone want some coffee? Vielfra watched through her viewport as 3 Concord cruisers broke formation and turned to follow the freighter. And she laughed. A real laugh, warm and unguarded, the kind she had learned from a species that had crawled out of a death world with fire in their hearts and gifts in their hands. The galaxy was not the same as it had been before the humans came. It was louder, messier, more chaotic, more frightening, and more alive. And it was, against all odds, and all logic, and all sensible prediction, better.